Hey, sorry for everyone who missed the first couple of minutes, but we're just started recording and we're going to be doing a quick overview of due diligence as well as my own personal take and recommendations on doing investor presentations to help you prep for next week. So 65% of companies fail because of lack of access to capital. So we know that capital is, basically the fuel that is going to keep your company alive so that you can basically grow into maturity. And being, really strategic about creating a capital strategy, being prepared for your companies to anticipate your company's cash needs, and just to make sure that you can, live on to fight another day through the various challenges that you're going to face in your business. So, there are a couple of different sources that we really focus on for early stage funding. Of course, there's crowdfunding, which, comes in a couple different formats. And one of the things that I actually like crowdfunding for is, doing a Kickstarter, or even, you don't necessarily have to use Kickstarter, but, figure out some way to create a digital campaign where people can pre-purchase your product. And, in theory, you don't even have to go on a Kickstarter platform to do it. You can kind of do it yourself. So if you, set up some opportunity for people to make pre-purchases of your product, that's a great way to, sort of get some of the initial capital that you need to finance your growth. Now, that doesn't work for everybody. For example, we had a company in the previous cohort that was kind of trying to do like a membership club. So for her, it made a lot of sense, right? So like when Soho House first started, it was like, okay, buy your membership before, Soho House opens, and you're going to get, a 20% discount on the annual fee, or you'll get some sort of a bonus. So, things like that you can pretty much easily justify selling in advance. It doesn't always work for every company. And same thing, we've seen a lot of people actually be successful with donations. I think Lynn said that she had a bunch of donations from people who just wanted to, help her with what she was doing. And it's a bit less complicated than actually doing it for equity. So, the next logical source is angel investors, right? So these are generally high net worth individuals that you might know, through some relationship, or professional angels. So there are individuals out there who, just professionally invest individually. One that I can remember here in New York is this guy, John Asen. He's like, 85 years old, and he just kind of runs around town, cutting checks in different startups. And he's not part of any sort of a group. And then the next thing you're going to see are organized angel groups, and that's a little bit more prevalent. So organized angel groups, can be an interesting source of capital, and they're one of the few sources of capital for people who are, at true seed rounds. And actually, I would say here in New York, things have gotten a little bit better because, let's say like 10, 11 years ago when I first started Golden Seeds, there were very few seed venture funds, very few. And now, over the last 10 years, I'd say in New York City, we probably have at least 15, maybe closer to 20. So, that, source of capital is kind of expanding. One of the things that's challenging about angel groups is, you're going to find that for the vast majority of people that deal with angel groups, they end up going through a very difficult, very time-consuming process that usually ends up with, no funding coming out of it. So angel groups are really fickle about what they will and won't invest in, and unfortunately, the sad truth of angel groups, which, as somebody who's run plenty of angel groups, I'm really familiar with, is that you as a founder are kind of part of their like entertainment product. So, the person who's managing the angel group, their job is to find investment candidates, to bring them to pitch events, to, provide something for their members to do due diligence on. And so a lot of times, even though the folks are not serious about investing, they just enjoy going through the exercise, which is, a huge waste of time and energy for you guys. So, just be very aware that, with a lot of angel groups, like it's wonderful to be invited, etc. But, I would say that For most angel groups, like 25% of what they're trying to do is like make investments, and then the other 75% is just, being able to consider themselves investors, to meet companies, to feel important, to feel like, they know what they're doing. So just realize that, that's a very, very real risk. That they're basically, kind of using your time as energy as a way to, keep themselves busy, keep themselves entertained, and they're not really serious about making a material investment in your company. And then, of course, the last is, seed venture capital. So seed stage VCs are, institutions who are under a mandate to deploy funds. So, it's better than angel investors because, like, they actually have to, invest this money. Um, the managers tend to be a little bit less hardcore than, some of the later stage VCs. But you'll still have to meet a lot of requirements, but they're probably more likely to give you like a quick yes or no. And, they're more reliable to get a check. Now, the other thing too that, I want to reiterate, and I believe that we were talking about this yesterday with Tanya, which is that a lot of people will say that they have a fund. And I've seen this a million times. People will be like, yes, I have this fund and hashtag we invest and blah, blah, blah. And then it turns out like they don't actually have any money. So do some research on whether, like, how well the fund is capitalized. So did they just raise money? Do they have money to deploy? Or maybe they're at a stage where like they don't really have money right now. So they'll be happy to talk to you, but unless they have money in the bank where, they can write a check, it can also be a little bit of a dangerous waste of time. So like really do your research and try and figure that out before, you go too far down the path with any one investor. So some other sources of capital, bootstrapping is great. There are a lot of accelerators out there that actually invest money. So, Techstars, 500 Startups, although they're kind of structured more as a fund now. Dream It. I know there's a new one called Digital Undivided. I mean, there are so many. They're usually going to give you, anywhere from like 20 grand to maybe up to kind of 125 grand for some of the later stage ones right off the bat. But you're going to usually pay pretty dearly for it with equity. The only accelerator that invests cash on unbelievably founder-friendly terms is Y Combinator, which, as you know, is really hard to get into. But also they have like Yuri Milner like doing their initial fund investment, and he was, strangely like not really doing it to get financial returns. So that's why the terms were, just like so lenient. Whereas, with most other programs, you're going to give up, usually 5 or 6 points of equity, which, could be material to you. So you really have to think about whether or not, that's worth it. Or you have other options for capital. There's an accelerator actually in Chile, which you could see Slide Bean, I think. Actually, I can't remember if they were out there, but they've done it. That gives, I think, about 50 grand in non-dilutive equity, but you have to live in Chile. It's the same thing. There's this very large business plan competition, which I'm a judge for in Buffalo called 43 North. They actually give out prizes of up to $1 million in capital. And to be honest, like so few people want to move to Buffalo that it's like not that hard to actually get accepted. I have a platinum pass, so if anybody is interested and willing to move to Buffalo for like $1 million, I guess the lowest prize is like 400,000, the highest prize is $1 million, and they give out like 8 or 9 prizes, so your odds of winning something are not terrible. If anybody's interested and willing to move to Buffalo and wants to talk to me about that, just let me know. I see I have a question from Lynn. Lynn says, I'm totally interested in Buffalo. Okay, Lynn. Well then, I will hook you up. We'll chat about it later when we have our one-on-one. Okay, cool. Buffalo is actually not bad. So they've flown me out there a couple times. I sort of do a similar session to this / my financial modeling session for the folks in their accelerator, which is cool. And yes, you can buy houses for really cheap out there. And it's, it is unbelievably actually a really, really beautiful city with some really beautiful homes. And because I guess back in like the early 1900s or something, Buffalo actually had like the most millionaires of anywhere in the world. So it's actually like the housing stock, you just look at it and you're like, whoa, this place is gorgeous. So if anyone else is interested to, just let me know. It's a great program. So the next thing I want to just, really quickly go over with you guys is kind of like valuations. And so like what kind of, range should you expect for different rounds? So, nowadays, sort of that under $500,000 raise is being usually referred to as a pre-seed. These things will often be done as a convertible note, but because convertible notes have caps, you're going to usually see a cap of anywhere from, 1 to 3 million on such a small round. I would say 1 million would be really, really low. I don't see anybody kind of getting into that range. I would more like say, for this kind of extremely early, kind of pre-product, very, very small round, you might see caps more of like 2 to 3 million is providing a good risk-adjusted valuation for your investors. Most people are doing, for most people, they would kind of do that in a friends and family scenario. Most of what we see are seed rounds. So seed rounds generally, $500,000 to two-ish, a little bit over 2 million. And valuations there, tend to be more like 2 to 6 million. So you can see here, like if you're noticing, if you're a math person and you're noticing some commonality amongst this number is that your valuation is based on how much you raise, and how much you raise is also based on your valuation. So usually in any one round you will typically be giving up 25, a quarter to a third of your equity. So that's basically kind of how it works. So the more money you're raising, it kind of pushes up your valuation, but you also have to have accomplished more in order to be able to justify raising more money. And so it's a little bit of a circular argument, but you can kind of see what it looks like. So seed rounds are usually, 2 to 6 million type valuation round. Series A, so here's the thing about Series A is usually people don't actually get to like the true Series A until they're already generating about 100,000 in monthly recurring revenue. Like if you talk to any Series A stage VC, they will always tell you, come back to me when you get to at least 100,000 in monthly recurring revenue. So at that point, you can actually justify, say, a $10 million pre-money valuation. If you guys remember David from our first session, who was the founder of Stash, they did their seed round, which was 3 million at a $10 million pre, right? So that's like the kind of, and that's after they already had like, all those people signed up on the wait list, etc. So you can kind of see like where people kind of flesh out, right? So it's usually like 3 on 10, and then as you raise more money, your valuation goes up. You're not giving away as much as the company. So it's a handy little chart. So the different funding vehicles that folks are typically working with, with equity rounds, what we're doing is, pricing the round, providing investor rights, selling actual equity, putting a board in place, and usually also providing some sort of a liquidation preference to investors. So, in theory, this is, a good way to go for both the investors and the founders, particularly for the investors, to have some clarity around exactly what's happening. The downside here is that they're just very expensive to do. So, the cost to actually like document a true preferred equity issuance is usually somewhere from like 20 to 50,000. So the problem is if you're only raising like $500,000, even if you're raising $1 million, spending $50,000 just on the legal fee, you kind of got 5% of your money, taken there right off the top. So that's why people tend to go with some of the more off-the-shelf, less expensive funding structures like convertible notes. So convertible notes can be done very, very cheaply, usually only for like 5 to 10,000. And what they'll do is instead, assign uh, structure the investment as quote unquote a loan. It's not, it's really equity. But the investor will get usually a certain rate of interest, which compensates them for the time value of money. That's usually between 4 and 8%. There's some sort of a discount rate, so they'll convert into the next qualified funding round at a discount to the next round. So if the discount's 20% and your next round of funding is done at $5 million, they would basically convert in as though they were paying only a $4 million pre-money. And then the other thing that it usually includes to protect the investor, let's see, Michael said that he lost sound. Let me just check my, okay, yep, looks like my audio is working. So if anyone else is having an issue with sound, just ping me and I'll figure it out. I don't hear anyone else saying that. Okay, so where was I? So valuation cap protects the investor. So if the discount is 20% and my valuation cap is, say $5 million, and the next funding round happens at a $10 million pre-money, instead of paying, an $8 million price for my equity, I can't pay any more than $5 million. So I would be able to convert to equity at that cap. So pretty simple, pretty common structure. It also has usually a maturity date. So the note has to convert in equity by a certain period of time. Now, just remember that even though it's called a note, you typically do not have the option to repay it. It's not like, oh, well, if I just pay them back, I can keep my equity. No, it's usually the investor has the right to either demand repayment or they will convert into equity. So some of the key terminology, and Matthew, just let me know if your sound's, or sorry, Michael, let me know if your sound's coming back on, or if anyone else is having an audio issue. So some of the key terminology that you will want to know as you're going into the fundraising process is, like what is your cap table, right? So your cap table, short for capitalization table, just means like who owns what of your company, right? So if you've issued some equity or you've had people do work for equity, make sure you put together an Excel spreadsheet that shows how much you own, how much your co-founders own, how much anyone else who has somehow acquired an interest in your company owns. A term sheet is just a basically plain English outline of what your deal is going to be. And so the reason that we have these is, it gives us a document that's really easy for people to read and understand before we start having the lawyers work on things that are complicated and difficult to read. It's basically just an outline of the proposed term for the real deal. So the issue here is, and I think we had spoken about this with the guys from Gunderson, is that generally they're not binding. So, even though you have one signed, it's not always 100% binding. So just, remember that. It's kind of more of a, let's just sort of agree on, what we're going to agree on before we start having lawyers spend, $10,000 to $50,000 papering the deal. And then also to know the difference between common and preferred stock. So what you have is common stock. Generally, investors are going to want you to have what we call founder stock. And founder stock makes a lot of sense because the only difference between founder stock and common is that the founder stock vests over time. So particularly if you have a co-founder, let's say you and your co-founder have agreed to a 50-50 split, but, something happens and 2 years from now your co-founder, needs to leave the company and do something else. Well, if your co-founder were to hang on to that 50% of the equity, you will have a really hard time finding somebody to replace them who's incentivized to do all the work needed to run the company. So we usually issue founder stock, which vests over time. So, maybe it's going to vest, 25% a year for the next 4 years. So that way, if your co-founder left after 2 years, you would basically get back 25% of the equity that you had granted them, which you could use to, give to somebody else who might replace them to incentivize them. And then the difference between, common and preferred is that typically people who are investing cash are investing their cash in exchange for preferred stock. And what that means really simply is that a preferred shareholder is entitled to get their money back first. So there's two different types of preferred, just straight preferred and participating preferred. So a straight preferred, which is fairly common in today's environment, as an investor, when there's a liquidation, I get, the opportunity to either, get my investment back first plus my preferred return, or I can, convert it into equity and see which one is more valuable and make a decision that way. But, my primary investment plus my preferred return is always protected, right? Like I'm entitled to at least that money back before you as a founder and a common shareholder get anything. Participating preferred, which I personally kind of agree with, but is less founder friendly, means that when there's a liquidity event, you have to pay me back, you have to give me back my preferred return, and then on top of that, like I get the repayment of everything I've invested, and then I take that aggregate value. So let's say I invested $1 million in your company and I had an 8% cumulative return. And the shares were outstanding for 5 years. So that means that the principal value of my investment is actually 1.4 million. So you would have to pay me back the 1.4 million, and then I would take that value of 1.4 million and convert it into equity as well at the valuation of the company. So whatever I own, let's say, we had used a $9 million pre-money valuation, and so I own 10% of the company. So basically I would get my $1.4 million paid back, plus, I would get, the equivalent value of that 1.4 million in equity. So I would also participate on top of that. And so while some people view that as double dipping, the way that, a lot of investors see it as being fair is that, nobody should be making money until we're all making money, right? And so, the theory here is that until I've been repaid my initial investment, I'm not making money. So by repaying my initial investment, you're basically bringing me back down to kind of like zero, right? So that's my initial investment plus the time value of money it puts me back at where I would have been if I had never given you the money. And then we all share in the appreciation of the equity. So that's a little bit of the explanation behind it. The next thing that you want to know about is dilution. So understanding dilution. The formulas are really complicated. So if you're not a math person, you're going to have a little bit of a hard time with it. But basically, when we look at anti-dilution provisions, etc., all we're trying to do is to account for the fact that as you bring in more money, your initial investors are going to have their equity interest reduced. And sometimes it can be significant and it can wipe you out. So there was a story in the news today you guys might want to look at. It's a good case study. This company called Munchery, which had done several rounds of funding. I believe that their last round was a Series C, in which they raised $80 million at a $300 million pre-money valuation. And apparently they spent all that money already. And so they just had to do another round like this week. And it got out that the pre-money valuation on the current round was $85 million. So what does that mean? That means that all of the original investors are basically completely wiped out. So, that is what dilution is. So a company can, quote unquote, be successful, raise a lot of money, go through periods of, high valuations. But the more money that they raise, the bigger the risk there is that the early investors will be severely diluted, and in some cases, like this Munchery situation, completely wiped out of their ownership. So it's something to think about and just be aware of. And unfortunately, that means that the founders and the early employees also got basically diluted to nothing. So it's an important thing for you to consider as well. So, the next rule of thumb that we use is, every time that you're raising capital, except for maybe, at the pre-seed round, try to raise enough capital to cover 18 to 24 months of runway. And the reason for this is that it takes about 6 months to raise money if you're, kind of one of the lucky ones. So you want to kind of give yourself like at least a year to just focus on building your business and not focus on raising money. So, if you can, that's sort of a good benchmark to aim for. So the next thing that I want to chat about is the due diligence process, right? So what are investors looking for in your company? And this, gets us into, what you want to have in your deck, right? Because like the deck, the pitch is basically the initial step of the due diligence process. So the first thing, they're looking for an awesome team, people that they can trust, people that they like, hopefully you have a great idea. They want to see traction. They want to see a large market opportunity, and then they want you to be aware of what your competition is, right? Because nobody likes to get into a highly competitive environment. So, just be aware of what the competitive forces are around your business and how much protection you have. So when we're getting into due diligence, with team, we're like, all right, how many people are on full time? Are they the right people for this? Do they have the right background? And then most importantly, do I trust the founders? So, this should go without saying, but I'm just going to say it verbally. Don't ever make anything up in your due diligence package. I've seen, several instances of really amazing companies with really amazing founders that ended up shooting themselves in the foot because they lied about something in the diligence process. So make sure that everything is totally above board. Don't make things up. Don't embellish your background. Just try to be as honest as you can, because trust is really, number one in this relationship. Next thing on the market, some things to think about market is like number one, and we're looking for an attractive market size. That usually means at least $1 billion. So figure out, is your market $1 billion or more? If not, you're going to have a little bit of a challenge. As I said before, what's the competitive landscape? Is the market growing, right? So, is your market growing or is it shrinking? If it's a shrinking market, you might want to rethink where you're going. And really, in thinking about that, it's like, is there some technology that's on the way to disrupt what you're doing? So be very, very thoughtful, because things are moving very quickly right now, especially with machine learning and, artificial intelligence and automation. Like, a lot of things are getting disrupted really quickly. So, just think quite hard, like, is it possible that, there's some technology on the horizon that's going to disrupt what I'm doing? And then, of course, the investment opportunity. So, what's your traction? Do you have revenue? Do you have customers? Does your business model make sense? Is it something that people need, or is it like a nice to have? If you just have a nice to have, that's way worse than, something that people need. So this is a little list of the typical questions that investors are going to ask you. So make sure you know the answers to all of them. So what is your burn rate, right? So the burn rate is, how much cash are you spending every month? So that is, cash in minus cash out. You're probably at a negative burn at this point. What does it take for you to reach break even? So like, make sure that this is why we do the financial model. We'll get to break even when we have 200 customers, whatever your metric is. And then, definitely understand your unique competitive advantage. A lot of people are not able to explain like why they're the right people to be doing the business. So make sure you've really thought that through. And then another thing that's awesome to have is to make sure that you actually have some information around your cost of acquiring customer and your customer lifetime value. So if you have those two metrics, or at least even a decent guesstimate of it, that's very impressive to investors and gives them some sense that there's some risk mitigation. As we talked about before, you want your cost of acquiring a customer to usually be like at least, a third or less of your customer lifetime value. And if you're in enterprise sales, also to understand the length of your sales cycle. So these are, I would, for all of you guys, just sort of make sure that you look at those questions. And all of the slides are in the handout section. So, another thing too, and Tanya mentioned this, is like, make sure that you take notes. Investors always ask the same questions. You know, write down the questions. You know, maybe you can get away with like secretly recording some of your meetings so that you can go back and, you know, just go over what you were asked and how you think that it went. But, you know, you're going to usually see people asking the same questions. So if you get stumped by something, you know, go back, find the answer, you know, get back to the investor, and then just be prepared for next time. So if we look at the fundraising timeline, just to give you guys kind of an idea, and I think Tanya talked about this a little bit yesterday, which is great. So, you know, you're going to get this initial introduction. It's much better to have a warm introduction. You're not always going to be able to get a warm introduction, but if you can, do it. Then you'll, you know, email them, you know, once they've decided to accept your communication, you might email them with like either your executive summary or like a very short pitch deck. I personally would rather have see like a really high level, maybe 10-page pitch deck rather than, you know, the formal executive summary. I feel like that's kind of going away a little bit. What I usually have people do is to write like a little paragraph blurb, right, that describes your business, maybe with like 3 or 4 bullet points on traction, and then to attach a high level, relatively short pitch deck. Oops. Hi, Andre. You have a question?
Oh, yes, Erica. So my question kind of goes back to a previous slide. I pivot and started my company like last year, October of last year. So when it comes to a team, I don't really have. I have advisors, I have contractors, but no one that I could consider a co-founder. And
Yep.
so, how can I guess spin this in a way to where it doesn't negatively affect me so much when I'm trying to, pitch to investors that say, hey, I got a great idea and I've done my homework, but I don't have the team assembled around me yet because I, started not so long ago.
Mm. Well, if you don't have the team around you yet, you know, that's an indicator that you're not ready for investment. And I'll just tell you why. One of the absolute number one most fundamental qualities that investors look for in a founder is, you know, companies aren't one person, right? It's the ability to get talented people around you.
Yeah.
So until you can prove that you're able to do that, you know, an investor really should question your ability to build a business, because in order to build a business, you have to be able to hire people. You have to be able to get people to work for you. So
Yeah.
although it seems like a catch-22, you know, what most people do is they line up, right? Like, you know, here are the people who, once I get funded, have agreed to come on board. We've already, you know, started working on it, and, you know, they're really interested. So the people don't have to be working full-time for you, like, right now, right? They don't have to, like,
Yeah.
leave and, you know, join you before you've gotten funded. But if you can at least say, you know, here's what our team is going to be like. You know, here are the 3 people. Usually you want to have like at least 3 people, you know, that you can kind of put on your team slide. You know, here are the 3 people that are going to make this business work. But,
Yeah.
you know, your most important job as a founder is not creating a product. It is harnessing human resources to build a business and create value.
Yeah, and just to add to that, that actually was my case. So I would come
Yeah.
and speak to people, and they would be very excited about the product, but I didn't have any sort of compensation, to provide. So it kind of like just stopped right there. Always
Yeah.
interested, but like, hey, okay, well, come talk to me once you have money.
Hmm.
That's pretty much what I ran into. So it was kind of a catch-22. So I didn't know how to address that, but I'll just kind of reach back out to them, and like I said, I never thought of just telling an investor, hey, these people are lined up to join once I get
Yeah.
money. So
Yeah.
I didn't think about that approach. So I think that's pretty cool.
Good. Well, awesome. You should definitely do that, and I think it'll help you tremendously. Thanks, Andre. All right, so we have a question from Richard. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Erica. There was just something you had tossed out, and I didn't get a clear focus on it. You said you should have at least a billion.
Hmm.
A billion what? I'm a little
Oh,
lost there.
your market size, so your addressable market.
Isn't that a huge, huge number?
Not really, no, because, you know, okay, just remember that if somebody is investing in your company, you're making a promise that your company will one day, have an exit, right? Which means it's probably going to need to be worth, somewhere between 50 and $100 million. And, if the total market is not at least $1 billion, what are the odds of you generating, more than like 20 or 30 million in revenue, right? If your addressable market is, 100 million, that means you have to capture like a third of it just to be even kind of on like the minimum size of what, people want. And that's very hard to do. So,
Erica, could you define addressable market? I'm sorry,
sure.
I'm
Sure. So your addressable market just means like, if everybody were to buy your product, like what would it be, right? So like, in the baby food category, right? So, okay, let's say I'm looking at making an investment in a baby food company. Well, there's 4 million babies born every year. Let's assume, that they all eat baby food for like 6 months. And, so, that's 2 million babies, eating baby food annually. And then, let's say that they are spending, $5 a day, on the baby food. So, it's just like you're doing a little calculation of exactly how much money is spent on this certain product, right?
sure. Okay, I get that, and that's a very good example. But let's take some software. Somebody's only going to buy a particular piece of software or an app once. And
Actually, that's totally not true because most software is, a SaaS model. And that's exactly why people use the SaaS model is because we want to have it be recurring revenue. So, I mean, I can think of almost every single enterprise software that I use right now. I'm paying $10 a month or, $50 a month or whatever it is.
I see. So the addressable market is I'm being very broad here, is the number of times the product can be sold to that more target focused market.
Yeah, I mean, or not even so much. It's the total amount of money that's being spent, like, on your problem right now. So if I know, like, for example, over the last 2 years, we, saw a lot of software companies coming up with enterprise HR solutions. And why? It's like, well, if you look at all of these large corporations, they're spending, they've got a budget of like 50 million each for, on-campus recruiting or whatever specific, thing it is that they're trying to do related to recruiting. So we know, okay, let's say that there's, 100 companies, that are each spending this $50 million. Okay, wonderful. So, we've now got like a $5 billion, dollar market opportunity. I can point to, we can go and get the information that this is how much, these divisions are spending on this problem. Or, if you were in the healthcare technology sector, you would know hospitals are spending, X dollars every year, X billion dollars every year, trying to address this problem. So that's really kind of what it means when we say addressable market. Or, if you have sort of like a new thing, it's to say, hey, my product or service, it's Netflix, right? It's $10 a month, and there's at least like 1 billion people out there, who would possibly want to, subscribe for my service and could afford it. So, obviously huge.
But Erica, and that, of course, that is similar to my example.
Right.
There aren't 1 billion people in the United States, but there are 1 billion, and this is where I'm trying to nail you down. There are 94 million Netflix subscribers right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's the number as of a month ago.
Uh-huh.
Tell me how that relates to 1 billion. Is it the number of transactions over a period of time to hit that billion? Or
Well, so if they have, I mean, so they already have close to 100 million people, right, who are spending already $100 a year. So they've already, exceeded, they've already exceeded that, right? So, they're there in terms of, meeting their revenue thing. But of course, the market opportunity is much larger than what, they actually have realized, right? because even though there's 100 million people on Netflix right now, there are actually a lot more people that could be on Netflix that they still have yet to acquire. So they've not 100% penetrated their market. Obviously, their market opportunity is much larger, but because it's so huge, for them to get to 100 million customers is actually not unreasonable, which is why they've gotten there.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
So, yeah. So, if they're charging, whatever it is, $9, a month, and they've already gotten, their 100 million users that are paying about 100, per year, they've penetrated maybe like 10% of the total market opportunity, and so the company's doing really well. It'd be highly unlikely for them to penetrate, 100% of the total market opportunity. So what we want to know is that the market opportunity is so big that if you only penetrate, like, say, 10% of it, you still have enough revenue to create a really valuable business where you can generate an exit. So, okay, cool. And good for Netflix. Nice. That's a lot of users. And so, the good thing is, for your own business, you kind of have, this evidence to point to, right? Just the way that when we looked at the Buzz Table model, they were selling a product to the restaurants, right? A software product to the restaurants. They could use OpenTable's success as an example of a similar product they were selling to a similar market, and to show, hey, they actually got to 15,000 enterprise clients or whatever it was in the first 5 years. All right, cool. We have a couple more questions. Let's see. Hey, Derek, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it?
Sure, I can ask it. It's kind of a follow-up question regarding the team, and that is, so if you take the approach to where you don't have the money to hire anyone currently, so it's kind of on their word that they will come on board. What if they don't actually come on board once you're funded? So like you told the investors, hey, I've got this rock star marketing guy who's going to be head of marketing, and then you get the money and they don't actually come on board. Does that hurt your relationship with the investor then?
So, anything is possible, right? I mean, a whole multitude of things could go wrong. Usually, if, if an investor is making an investment and, they're sort of serious about it, they are going to talk to the person. So they're going to talk to your potential marketing person, right? They're going to expect that you bring them into a meeting or something like that. So they won't just kind of like, rely on your word for it, and then all of a sudden, boom, you're funded and you're all alone. They would probably have some conversations, with that person and, say, hey, are you, committed to doing this, and, how much equity is that guy going to get, and, sort of et cetera, et cetera. So, yes, they would be upset, if you promised something and then the person flaked. But, part of their diligence process is making sure that the team is who they say they are.
Okay.
Yeah. So, we see that a lot, right? It's like people will bring in a slide deck and they'll, put up like a whole, bunch of fancy advisors, and then, we actually call the person and they're like, I've never even like heard of that guy, or like we met like one time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that does happen. Great. All right. We have a question from Kieran. Hi, Kieran.
Hey, Erica. Yeah, I had a follow-up question in regard to the total market. So in our deck, should we list the total market in terms of like the amount of people in that market that we're going after, or or what that market is worth?
I think it's good to list both. You definitely need to know what it's worth. So in our Netflix example, we would say, listen, Netflix has already gotten acquired 100 million, users in the market, and they're generating 10 billion in revenue off of, recurring subscription income. So we know that the market, right now in terms of what people are actually spending on live streaming content is, at least 10 billion, right? Plus you have whatever they're spending on Hulu and all of these other things. So I think that you will need to know both. And you want to describe it as both. So it really depends on who your customer is. Right? We gave the two examples. One was in a B2C company where you have many, many users spending relatively small amounts on a product, but still coming up with a $10 billion, market revenue opportunity. And then you have, the enterprise software example, which is maybe we're focused on, Fortune 100 companies that, are allocating maybe, 20 million each to solve a certain problem. So we want to get an idea of like who the customer is and how many there are so that we can understand concentration. But then we also need an estimate of the overall size of the opportunity.
Right, and that needs to be specific to what they're spending on the problem. You're saying, right, on your product, not like what they're spending, not what they're worth based on like whether they're Generation Z or millennial or
yes, it's what they're willing to solve the problem. So like for example, if you started a T-shirt company and then you came to me and said, the total market for clothing, in the world is, $200 million a year, I'd be like, yeah, but,
right.
not all that's going to be spent on your T-shirts. So you have to really kind of narrow it down to, what is sort of the niche that I'm going after, and, people who are spending money on a problem and, don't have many alternatives, besides kind of the solution that I'm providing and are willing to pay for it.
Okay. Thanks, Erica.
No problem. Okay, cool. So moving on. So we got to phase 2. So phase 3 would be scheduling your first call. So this will usually be like a phone diligence call. If that goes well, you'll meet with them in person. Usually have at least one follow-up meeting with other partners. And then hopefully you get to, signing a term sheet, right? So once the term sheet is signed, you guys basically agreed on, what the deal will be, and now the lawyers go about, creating the documents, getting them signed, and wiring the cash. So the important thing is to remember is that there are 7 phases here, and really you're not done until phase 7 is done, because there's actually so much that can happen between phase 6 and phase 7, like I can't even tell you guys. I talk to founders every day because we have an investing platform, and I will see so many people that are literally at like phase 3 and they act like they've already been funded. So just realize that there are a lot of hurdles between sort of having your first meeting scheduled or having your first call scheduled and actually getting funded. And the check's not, don't count on it until the money is wired and in your hand. So, a couple little tips for you guys during the due diligence process is like, first of all, really you want to give them a sense of your big picture vision and an overview of where you guys are heading, right? So it's, showing the investor that, you have a vision for 5 years down the road of this being a company that's worth, at least $100 million. Another thing is to just, make sure that you follow up, right? So I think Tanya had talked about this, or maybe it would have been Kaya. I don't know, both of them are pretty skilled fundraisers, but a big thing that helps is to, maybe like once a month you send some updates out to your potential investor and advisor community to keep them posted on the milestones you've achieved, right? So getting an email once a month from a company that I've invested in or that I've considered investing in, letting me know what's going on, letting me know, the good things that they've done, letting me know what areas they maybe need help with, starts to create a relationship, right? And it's very scalable because you're just literally sending an email to people. And just remember that it might take a while before your investor feels comfortable enough to write a check. So just keep in touch. Just like be a nice person. Let them know that you can trust. They can trust you. Just make sure that you follow up and you continue the relationship. So 3 of the most common items of negative feedback that you're going to get from investors are, number one, you don't have enough traction, right? So as we said, typical Series A investors want to see 100,000 in monthly recurring revenue is usually what they're just going to like tell you off the bat. They're going to tell you they're too early. They might be like, well, we'd be more comfortable if you did X, Y, and Z. Just be really aware that there are two types of companies, right? One type of company is one where the founder has some relationship with the investor, or they've proven themselves with another startup before. And in this case, these can be like the types of companies where you're like, how did they get funded? Like they haven't really, done anything, or they just have an idea. Unfortunately, the world is not fair, so relationships have a lot to do with it. And if you previously worked for a startup that was a unicorn or very, very successful, it's going to be much easier for you to raise money going forward. Now, if you don't fall into any of these categories, now you find yourself jumping through a lot of hoops. So, when they say that you're too early, it's fine. Maintain the relationship, right? They still want to follow you as you grow. Ask them, say, what are two or three milestones, that if we achieve might make you interested in this product, and then get that feedback and follow up with them. So a lot of the reasons why you might get rejected by investors. So first of all, you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. This is like number one. I see a lot of people who are like, oh my God, I have this like really cool idea, and it sounds cool, but it's not really a huge pain point or a huge problem for people. Two is, and even if you think about Facebook, right, which we think of as like the classic unicorn, I mean, you guys watched probably the movie The Social Network, his whole thing was like, oh my gosh, there's no way for me to, figure out the relationship status of like some woman in my class, right? So, even though we would think, oh, is Facebook like a need to have or just a nice to have? Well, actually, that's like a pretty pressing problem, right? Like you have no idea, who is single and who isn't, right? And so the internet kind of like really revolutionized that to like a high extent. But he found like a very high value problem. It wasn't just like, hey, wouldn't it be nice if you could, chat with your friends online and share pictures? It was actually like, there's a pain point here and we're able to solve it for people. The next is that customers aren't willing to pay for your service. So this is something that you want to be really careful about. Sometimes you end up in sectors where there are some like highly capitalized companies that are basically giving away whatever it is that you're making to your customer for free. So just be really careful around, can I actually get people to pay for this? Am I creating value that's going to cause them to open their wallet, or somehow I can capture some of the money that's flowing through whatever transaction I'm facilitating. Next is like if you have no track record or applicable background, it's going to be really hard. Hyper-competitive market, we just kind of talked about that. And then there's another thing, that I think is really important to think about. So, and I recommended reading 0 to 1 in our reading list on the internal site. One of the, really most important takeaways I think from that book is that, Peter Thiel outlines that in order for your startup to be successful, whatever it is that you're doing has to provide a 10x improvement over the existing solution. So if it's just like a marginal improvement, it's like, oh, it's like a 50% better experience. It's really not worth it, right? Because it takes a lot for people to change their behaviors. So, you really have to make sure that whatever product is you're offering, there should be an order of magnitude improvement in customer experience or whatever it is that you're doing. Next is like the market's too small. So, if you're dealing with like $100 million market, it's going to be really tough to get attention. You're not making any progress month over month. There's no growth. Or you might just not fit their investment thesis or stage. So, part of it is finding the right type of investor that actually invests in your sort of deals. All I can say for you is it's a tough road ahead. You want to treat objections as requests for further information and not take them personally. The most important thing that I would advise you when you're talking to investors is like basically our job as investors is to like crap all over your baby. And I know it hurts and it feels weird. And even for me, like when I was doing, my user research and talking to investors, you know, when I launched 1,000 Angels, I mean, I really hated to hear people being like, well, it won't work because of X, Y, or Z. So you kind of just really got to put your ego aside, and just, you know, realize that, you know, you're learning from every conversation. Even if the feedback isn't what you wanted to hear, you just need to realize that it's not about you personally, it's simply about your business, and businesses are hard, and, you know, you can poke a million holes in them kind of at the beginning. But the more people poke more holes in your business, like the better prepared you're going to be to make sure that it goes successfully. So I know we have quite a few more slides. I probably am not going to get through everything today, and we're kind of getting to our hour. So what I will probably do is, let me think. I don't know how I had this like 60 slide deck in for like a 1 hour schedule of time. What I'll probably do is figure out maybe some time on Monday to go through this stuff with you guys. So hopefully Monday will work. Yeah, I can probably do Monday from 12:30 to 11:30. Now, the good news is that the other half of this presentation is pretty much on the same topic that Kaya talked to you guys about. So, you know, this is basically just me reinforcing it. So what I'd like to do is set up a bonus session for Monday. We can do the same time, kind of like 12:30 to 1:30. And then I'll kind of go through my whole, you know, pitching, you know, advice. And then what we'll do is on Tuesday will be a little bit more of an open office hours for you guys to practice your pitches with me, and to see, you know, sort of do a little mini run through of your decks, etc., before we have the final demo day on Thursday. So I hope that that's okay with everybody. And, you know, anybody who wants one-on-ones, you know, please reach out to me. I'm happy to schedule those probably for tomorrow afternoon. And then let's see, Lynn has a quick question. How do you determine the best way to fund your product? Okay, well, you know what? We'll talk about that during our one-on-one, Lynn. And I hope everybody has a really fantastic day, and looking forward to chatting with you during our Monday bonus session. All right? Have a good day, guys. And feel free to email me if you want a one-on-one. I'm around all afternoon tomorrow as well. All right. Bye.